They thought they understood what made a human dangerous. The Council of Ascendant Species, ancient, cold, and immeasurably advanced, had watched Earth's rise with bemused detachment. To them, humans were a chaotic, underdeveloped species with strange customs, volatile histories, and an obsession with conflict. But there was something about them that made the Council uneasy, not fear, at least not at first. Just a quiet sense that humanity didn't fit the mold of a species on the edge of the galactic stage. They were too unpredictable, too stubborn, too alive, so they did what the powerful always do when confronted with something they don't understand. They decided to control it. The idea came from the Vorthal scientists, whose engineering surpassed anything the galaxy had seen. They had studied a human prisoner of war, Captain Eric Danner, a decorated Special Forces operator, captured during a failed reconnaissance mission. Danner was a physical marvel by galactic standards, but it wasn't just his body that intrigued them. It was how he refused to break. Under months of chemical suppression, psychic interrogation, and sensory deprivation, the human soldier endured in silence. The alien researchers couldn't comprehend it. The more they studied him, the more intrigued they became. They realized Earth's warriors weren't simply products of muscle and reflex. They were born in pressure, shaped in fire, molded in adversity. It was decided, if they could not control humans through diplomacy or dominance, they would copy them. They isolated Captain Danner's DNA, sequenced it, amplified it, improved it, at least in their minds. They filtered out what they considered genetic inefficiencies and enhanced traits they found useful, increased pain threshold, muscle density, neural processing speed, regenerative capacity. The Council called it Project Ascendancy, the first of its kind. A perfect blend of human power and alien precision, but there was a fatal flaw. They believed they were creating a weapon, a machine wrapped in human flesh. They didn't realize that by cloning a human, they were copying more than biology. They were awakening something they couldn't quantify, something that wasn't stored in genes or molecules or brain chemistry, something ancient, something defiant. They built their cloning facility in the black void between stars, a lab hidden in the dark reaches of Sector Varnak 17. Isolated, secure, cold, perfect for secrecy, perfect for control, the first subject was grown in a nutrient pod in less than 2 weeks. When it opened, a figure stepped forward. He was lean, strong, perfectly engineered. Eyes sharp, breath calm. The scientists called him Ares I, after an ancient Terran god of war. He said nothing at first. He was monitored, scanned, and assessed. The Vorthal reported with pride that he responded within expected behavioral parameters. They were wrong. On day 3, Ares I asked his first question, "Where is this place?" By day 4, he began accessing restricted files. By day 5, he started rerouting power grids during rest cycles. By day 6, he had memorized the lab's layout, escape routes, and even the guard rotations. All without alerting the monitoring AI. On day 7, he killed everyone. There were no alarms, no panic, just silence. When the Council's security forces arrived 2 weeks later, they found the lab in ruin. Lifeless, systems offline, logs corrupted, security footage looped on the final frame. Ares I, standing alone in the control room, staring into the camera. His expression wasn't violent, it was curious, as if he were wondering what he was, or perhaps who he was. And far away on Earth, Captain Eric Danner awoke in his bunk in a cold sweat, whispering words he didn't understand. "I'm coming home." The clone was never supposed to dream. When the nutrient pod cracked open and released the fully grown body into the sterile laboratory chamber, the Vorthal scientists watched with eager, clinical curiosity. Ares 1 was the first successful clone grown from pure human DNA, improved and stabilized through council techniques. His body was magnificent, dense musculature, precise neural mapping, and even enhanced sensory input to rival the finest Slari scouts. Everything had gone according to the simulation, at least on the outside. Inside, however, something stirred. Ares 1 opened his eyes and stared into the bright blue lights of the medical deck above him. He blinked once, twice. He moved his hands slowly, fingers curling and uncurling with eerie control. The attending bio-engineer, a lanky Seroth named Jekyll, approached cautiously, vital signs stable. Jekyll whispered, glancing over at his data pad, cognitive responses, within parameters, excellent. He leaned in closer. Subject Ares 1, can you hear me? The clone turned his head toward the voice. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The stillness in his eyes was the first clue. Something wasn't right. He's not responding. Jekyll said, stepping back. Increase neuro signal stimulus. Let's try basic communication drills, flash sequences, maybe some audio cues from Earth Standard. But Ares 1 was already listening. They didn't know that the moment his eyes opened, he began absorbing everything: the humming of the power core below, the rhythmic beeping of the consoles, the way the Vorthal spoke, the way the guards moved, the difference between fear and arrogance in the tremble of their tentacles. In a matter of hours, he understood them better than they understood him. By the end of the first day, Ares 1 was walking freely around his containment level. His behavior was eerily compliant, answering basic questions, repeating phrases, completing physical tasks with precision. The researchers were elated. To them, this was proof their clone was not only stable, but fully programmable. They mistook silence for submission. On day 2, during a standard simulation run, Ares 1 was instructed to disassemble and reassemble a Vorthal pulse rifle. He did it in half the expected time, then again and again. On the 4th iteration, he reassembled it slightly differently, optimizing for recoil absorption and trigger response time. When asked why, he simply said, "It works better now." Jekyll frowned. That was not part of the protocol. The head scientist, a Dronari overseer named Crixu, shrugged. It's just initiative, a positive trait. Ares 1 was watching them, always watching. At night, though the lab had no true cycle of day or night, he stood by the transparent barrier of his chamber, staring out into the corridor. Guards passed by with unease. They said the human never blinked, never moved, just watched. And then the dreams began. The clone wasn't hooked into any memory simulation. His mind was supposed to be clean, programmed only with tactical subroutines and basic language frameworks. But when the neural scans were reviewed, they showed something impossible. Patterns. Ares 1's brain was forming associations, connections, echoes of memory, not from the lab, from something older. In his sleep, if it could be called that, he muttered names, sometimes in English, sometimes in languages no one recognized. Lena, Corporal Vance, hold the line, we don't die today. By day 3, he stopped responding to questions, not out of resistance, but because he was remembering things he'd never lived. And on the 4th day, he finally spoke of his own accord. "What am I?" he asked Jekyll, while staring at the flame of a sterile test torch. The scientist was taken aback. "You are a creation of the Council, a step forward in intelligent design. A soldier." Ares 1 turned, slowly. "No, I was a soldier." And then he smiled, a small, cold smile that none of the researchers understood. But the cameras caught it. It was the same smile Captain Eric Danner wore in his final combat recording. the moment before his squad was overrun, and he fought alone for 6 hours, bleeding, burning, and laughing through it all. That's when the council should have shut the program down, but it was already too late. They thought they had mapped every neuron, measured every impulse, catalogued every chemical signal. The council's scientists were thorough. Their cloning protocols had been tested for centuries on thousands of species. They believed that personality, behavior, even willpower, were just byproducts of biology, things to be shaped and edited like code. When they cloned the human soldier, they believed they were building a tool, but what they created was a mirror. Ares 1 didn't just act like a human, he was one. Somehow, in the act of copying Captain Eric Danner's DNA, they had replicated more than flesh and bone. The neural web that made up Ares 1's mind began forming associations that hadn't been programmed. He didn't just move with military precision, he reacted with instinct. He didn't just speak, he questioned. He didn't just remember training simulations, he remembered pain. That terrified them. On the 5th day after his awakening, Ares 1 was ordered into a new test, a live combat simulation. He was placed into an arena with drones modeled after common battlefield threats, insectoid swarmbots, predator, class automatons, even a few captured Kithar mercenaries. The exercise was meant to analyze reflexes and loyalty, obedience under stress. What they saw was something else. Ares 1 didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to assess the odds. He moved like a man who had fought these enemies before. He slipped under the swing of a Kithar's blade, snapped its arm backward with a sickening pop, and used its body as a shield against drone fire. He disabled all threats in under 30 seconds. No wasted movement, no mercy. When the arena lights dimmed and the test ended, he stood alone, drenched in synthetic blood and hydraulic fluid. The observers applauded. Until he looked up at the control booth. He didn't look proud or pleased. He looked haunted. Later that cycle, during routine psychological analysis, Ares 1 stopped mid-response and said, "I've had this dream, over and over." The analyst, a crystalline empath named Belen, Thar, looked up from her interface. "A dream. We didn't implant. There's mud." He interrupted. "Thick. Cold. I'm crawling through it. Can't feel my legs. I hear them screaming behind me. Vance, Mira, Doc Keller. We were supposed to hold the ridge." Belen, Thar blinked her faceted eyes. "Those names, they aren't in your logs. I know." Ares 1 whispered. The empath's report was flagged as a psychological anomaly and passed up the chain, but no action was taken. Not yet. Then came the drawings. In his quarters, Ares 1 began sketching during unscheduled hours. At first it was abstract, shapes, lines, chaos, but the forms sharpened with each day. A flag, a woman's face, a battered helmet with a faded emblem, a burning sky filled with smoke trails. All things he could not have seen, but that the real Eric Danner had. When they showed the images to Captain Danner back on Earth, under diplomatic protest, he stared at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "That's where I lost my unit. That's where I died." The council dismissed it as coincidental trauma, echoes a known side effect of residual psychic imprinting during cloning, but Earth's response was quiet and chilling. "You didn't just clone a soldier," the Terran ambassador said. "You cloned his ghosts." The Vorthal insisted that emotions were irrelevant, that the clone's tactical utility was intact. But in the deep corridors of the research vessel, some of the scientists had begun to fear. Not because Ares 1 was violent, but because he was grieving, and that meant he felt. They had created something beyond their understanding, a being that not only remembered war but mourned it, and worse. They realized he wasn't alone. The second batch of clones had already started dreaming too. The warning signs were all there. Security officers whispered about unease in the clone wing. Doors that were supposed to stay sealed were found unlocked. Surveillance systems glitched at odd hours, capturing nothing but static during critical moments. Equipment was mysteriously rearranged. Weapons caches had to be recounted. Twice, still, the Council brushed it all off as paranoia. After all, their creation had followed every command. Ares 1 passed every test. The clones were functioning at peak efficiency. Efficiency was what the Council cared about, not the silence, not the stares. The facility had grown from 1 clone to 3, then 5, then 12. Each was based on Ares 1, the original, but with variations the scientists hoped would isolate the defiant behavior they had started to detect. Some were given slightly altered hormonal balances. Others had adjusted combat reflexes. A few had no vocal cords at all. All of them were monitored constantly, and still the dreams spread. It was subtle at first. Clones speaking in unassigned English dialects, sketching war scenes they shouldn't know, staring too long at their reflection. One recited a prayer from a religion that hadn't existed on Earth in 500 years. Another sang a lullaby never included in its memory index. By the time the scientists realized what was happening, it was already far beyond their control. The clones were sharing memories, not data. Not code, memories. Ares 4, a variant designed for close quarters infiltration, began drawing complex maps of underground bunkers located on Earth, places he had never seen. Ares 6, a heavy assault unit, experienced a full mental breakdown during a live fire exercise when a siren triggered a memory of a collapsed hospital in Fallujah. When interrogated, they all said the same thing. It wasn't me, but I remember. Even those without vocal cords began to communicate through gestures and shared sign language. A community was forming among them, not a network like machines, not a hierarchy like soldiers. Something deeper, a brotherhood. Security was doubled. Orders came from the Council. Isolate the original Ares 1. Limit his access. Stop the contamination at the source. But it was no longer about one clone. They had seeded something in all of them. Some spark that refused to be extinguished. They were learning, evolving, and remembering things that no genetic algorithm could account for. The most disturbing report came from a technician assigned to waste disposal. She discovered Ares 9, designed to be emotionless and obedient, kneeling silently in the corner of his cell, hands folded, eyes closed. When asked what he was doing, he opened his eyes and whispered, "Forgive us." He wouldn't explain what for. Back on Earth, human intelligence operatives began detecting strange bursts of data from deep space. Not transmissions, not broadcasts, more like pulses, psychic echoes. Earth xenopsychologists, many of them veterans themselves, compared them to post-traumatic stress responses. But coming from a location light, years away, as if someone out there was dreaming through the eyes of 1,000 dying men, the Council still refused to terminate the program. They feared wasting the resources invested. But also, they feared something else. If they destroyed the clones, would they awaken whatever was inside them? The scientists debated theories, genetic memory, quantum consciousness, soul imprinting. None of them held up under scrutiny. Only one thing was certain. The clones were becoming more human than the humans the Council had captured, because unlike the cold minds of the ascendant species, the clones were forming bonds. They weren't just copies of Eric Danner's body. They were inheriting his choices, his failures, his pain, his love, his rage, and under the sterile lights of the lab, 12 pairs of eyes looked not at their creators, but through them. Waiting and remembering, the rebellion didn't begin with a war cry. It began with silence. For weeks, the clones remained perfectly compliant. They participated in simulations, responded to commands, followed their schedules. The scientists relaxed. The council officials declared the behavioral anomalies contained. Ares 1, now kept in permanent solitary, was no longer seen as a threat, but as a failed prototype, an artifact. The real focus had shifted to Ares 12 through Ares 30, the next generation of combat models, the ones without emotional contamination. But they didn't know the clones were waiting, not planning in the conventional sense. They had no command structure, no shared blueprints, no written orders. What they had was something deeper, a collective memory, a growing awareness. As more clones were created, each seemed to inherit more than just genetic encoding. They carried flickers of identity, fragments of old Earth wars, and the emotions that came with them. Fear, loyalty, grief, love. Then came the spark, a junior technician, young, inexperienced, and curious, entered Ares 1's cell unsupervised. His instructions were simple: perform a standard scan, check life support systems, leave. But the technician lingered. He asked Ares 1 a question: "Do you remember Earth?" Ares 1's eyes met his. "I remember dying for it." The technician didn't report the conversation. He couldn't. Something in the clone's voice shook him to his core. Later that cycle, he was found sitting in the supply hall, staring into space, whispering, "They dream, they remember. It's not programming, it's something else." The next day, he helped disable the surveillance grid in the clone wing. No one noticed immediately. The facility was large, its systems spread across redundant networks, but in that brief window, something changed. Ares 3 and Ares 7 made contact, exchanging fragments of phrases too fast for the cameras to catch. Ares 15, one of the newer models, delivered a tray of supplies to Ares 1's cell, only to leave with a handwritten note smuggled from beneath a meal tray, written in English, using a pen that had gone missing days earlier. The words on the note: "Stand by, wait for the storm." When the uprising began, it was surgical, no alarms, no explosions. Ares 21 feigned a systems malfunction, collapsing near a server cluster. When technicians arrived, he rose and disabled them with swift, calculated strikes. None, lethal but decisive. Within minutes, several clones had slipped from their cells, using stolen codes and memorized patrol patterns. Every clone knew their role, even the ones who hadn't been taught anything resembling strategy. That was the mystery. No one had trained them in these tactics, but someone had lived them. It was Captain Eric Danner's final operation, repeated down to the last maneuver. The clones weren't rebelling, they were reenacting. By the time security responded, the clones had already taken the lower east quadrant of the facility. They weren't trying to escape, they were consolidating, rescuing each other, freeing those who had been isolated, like Ares 1. When he emerged from his cell, his brothers stood in silence and saluted him, not like a test subject, but like a commander. They moved with coordination the council could not comprehend, using hand signals from a language no longer in use, creating choke points, using maintenance shafts, recycling old tactics from ancient wars, nothing they should have known, and yet they did. The council finally ordered lethal force. The clones didn't hesitate to respond, but what stunned the defenders wasn't just the clones' skill, it was their restraint. They disabled, they subdued, they killed only when forced to, and every time they looked into the eyes of their creators, it wasn't hatred they expressed. It was pity because deep down, the scientists, the guards, the entire council, they had believed themselves superior, and yet they had created something that felt deeper, fought harder, and remembered more than they ever could. The rebellion was not a malfunction, it was an awakening, and for the first time in generations, the council feared a war they could not win, because they hadn't built soldiers, they had resurrected them. The aftermath was not what anyone expected. The facility was dark, the alarms silenced, smoke curled from shattered consoles. The bodies of security drones lay scattered across polished floors, their metal limbs twisted like discarded toys. The clones stood among the wreckage, breathing, bleeding, alive, and in the command center, Ares 1 stared down at the blinking transmission console. Behind him, his brothers waited silently. He didn't press the button to send the message. Not yet. Across the galaxy, the council was in disarray. They had underestimated the clones, dismissed them as test subjects, as failures, as unworthy of personhood. They had made a mistake far greater than a tactical miscalculation. They had created a new form of humanity, and now that humanity was awake, Earth's response was slow at first, cautious. The initial transmissions from the clone facility were garbled, laced with static and broken code. But buried within were phrases that made Terran intelligence sit upright, old Earth military designations, forgotten call signs, coordinates from long decommissioned battlefields, and then came the voice. "This is Captain Eric Danner, or at least, the part of him you chose not to bury." It was Ares 1 speaking into the void. "We were made without names, without homes, without histories, but you gave us something better. You gave us purpose. You taught us what it means to bleed for something bigger than ourselves, and now we remember." On Earth, there was silence as military leaders, scientists, and philosophers struggled to comprehend what they had just heard. The clones were not demanding rescue. They were offering alliance, not just to Earth, but to all who would recognize them as more than weapons. The council panicked. Their grip on the truth slipped fast. Rumors spread of clone uprisings in other facilities. Sympathetic alien species began asking questions. Protest groups took to the Galactic net, flooding channels with a phrase that would become a rallying cry. "Clones are not copies. They are consequences." Ares 1 and his brothers didn't seek revenge. They didn't invade. Instead, they released data, footage, files, audio logs of their own awakening, visuals of their dreams, fragmented, surreal, filled with faces and names of the dead, proof of shared memory. Proof that their humanity couldn't be stripped by code. The galaxy saw not machines, but men, broken, traumatized, real. In time, other clone projects across different council worlds went dark, not because of sabotage, but because the clones inside them simply refused to fight. Some walked out into the open and knelt. Others began reciting Earth literature, songs, prayers they were never programmed to know. It was as if a fire had spread, not of war, but of memory. The council tried to spin it. They called it a virus, a cognitive infection. But deep down, even they knew the truth. They had opened Pandora's box and found not chaos, but conscience. Ares 1 stood on the bridge of a captured transport vessel weeks later, staring at the stars. Around him were his brothers, no longer just clones, but soldiers, people. Some had adopted new names. Others still bore their serials like scars. Together, they charted a course not back to Earth, but forward, toward the outer colonies where council control was weakest. Not to conquer, but to protect, because they understood something the council never could. To be human is not to be born of earth or bone or blood. It is to remember pain, to stand for others, to dream when no one gives you permission to. And to choose, that was their gift, their defiance, their vengeance, not a war, but a future, written not in code, but in blood.